So, with Pecharunt being recently revealed and joining the Mythical Pokemon family, it got me thinking about Mythicals, and more specifically, which Mythical Pokemon is objectively the worst. Throwing the word objective around in a series like Pokemon with so many passionately opinionated fans can definitely be dangerous, but it can also be fun to just poke the bear a little every now and then too. So today we are going to ask just that and look at which mythical Pokemon is objectively the worst. I made videos like this a while ago for both the starters and the legendaries, and so I thought it would be fun to go ahead and cover the mythicals as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. Time is running out, guys, for you to be able to get this exclusive Folkachi promo card with purchases of my Folkachi plushie. Folkachi is the mascot of my channel from the new monster taming video game that I am currently working on, Celebi Chronicles, and he has come to life not only in plush form, but now in TCG form too, as you can now get a free promo card of Folkachi from the upcoming Celebi Chronicles TCG that you can't get anywhere else. But time is running out to get this special card, as it's only available until February 9th, 2024, and then it's gone. So to get this card, you gotta hop on this deal right away. It's free with all purchases of the plush, and the quality on both is amazing. The plush is super soft and squishy and just well put together, and the card is as beautiful as any TCG card that I have ever seen. So these are honestly amazing, not to mention that picking them up also supports the content that I create immensely and helps make more of it happen, including more awesome products just like these. So pick up a plush and a card today at Histrobishop.com. That link is in the description below, and get this special Folkachi promo card before it's gone, which is right around the corner on February 9th. Again, go to Histrobishop.com with the link in the description below to pick them up, and a huge thank you to everyone who has picked them up so far and for helping to make all of my content possible. Okay, so before we start this, we've got to lay down some ground rules. Number one is that this is just for fun, so don't take it too serious, even though we are trying to be as objective as possible here, because it's really not that big a deal. Number two is that I say objective as possible because with so many different variables that determine how good or not a mythical Pokemon is, and with Pokemon essentially being works of art and therefore very subjective, you can only be so objective even if you are able to look at this under an objective lens, and ultimately can still determine basically more or less who is the worst for all intents and purposes. It is a bit of an inexact science, I will admit, even though we can still come to a certain degree of certainty on this, so it's not like I'm trying to say my word is the law or anything. Like I said, this is just basically a fun experiment, and if you have any other thoughts or differing ideas, you can leave those in the comments below. With that in mind though, here is how we're going to break things down. Similar to my previous video, we're going to break things down by category and determine the worst Pokemon in each category, and then use that to determine the worst Pokemon overall. Those categories will be base stats, typing, ability, and whether or not the mythical has an in-game event. These categories are chosen because they are the most objective factors possible that can be judged when evaluating these Pokemon. Essentially, these are the things that are the most cut and dry that are going to allow us to be as objective as possible and that also stay as far away as possible from that subjective territory. In particular though, I wanted to explain a little bit more why I am including an event category here, because it is a little bit different to the other categories. Essentially, it's because it's pretty much an objective fact and a universally accepted belief amongst the fan base that it is better when mythical Pokemon have in-game events that provide a bit of gameplay alongside getting the chance to obtain them, versus just being handed the Pokemon for free with nothing more to it at all. In 25 plus years of being a Pokemon fan, I have never once heard anyone argue anything except that mythical in-game events are way better than just simple distributions. So I decided to include this in my evaluation since the events themselves are also a key part of the mythical Pokemon. With that said though, let's go ahead and start breaking things down. The simplest category of all here to determine a worst Pokemon in is base stats, so let's begin with that. The thing with Mythicals and base stats though is that most of them actually have a 600 base stat total, and this is a pretty key trait of being a Mythical because most of them have this exact base stat total. It's not an absolute requirement, and there are some exceptions that we're going to be getting into, but it does mean that most of the Pokemon we're going to be evaluating today have the exact same base stat total. The only Mythicals that fall below this are Keldeo with a 580 base stat total, Phione with 480, whose mythical status has also been a bit murky in the past as well, and Meltan, who sits at just 300. Due to most other Mythicals being much stronger, these guys are pretty much the worst of the worst, and that doesn't exactly give us a very exciting pool of candidates to work with here when it's cut down to just these three so quickly. So this is what we're gonna do. First, we will evaluate these Pokemon, and this will ultimately determine who is really and truly the worst mythical Pokemon of them all. But then, just for fun, I'm also going to evaluate the larger group of Mythicals outside of just these three who reside in that stronger base stat category, and we'll see who is the worst amongst them as well. With that in mind though, let's go ahead and look at our weaker group, and Meltan starts off with the early lead here, having the worst base stat total at just 300, with Phione following behind it at 480, and Keldeo once again after Phione at 580. Meltan is obviously the worst here because it evolves later on, but individually speaking, it is the weakest, so we've got to give it the badge of dishonor here. The next category we're going to look at though is typing, and while all types do indeed have concrete strengths and weaknesses, there's also a lot of nuance here that doesn't really lend itself the best to an objective analysis. So what I have decided to do is ultimately consult an expert, and that would be none other than Wolf Glick. You're probably all aware of him, but he is a former Pokemon VGC World Champion, so he's as much of an authority on this as anybody. He's made some videos ranking all of the types, as well as all of the different type combinations, which I will be referring to here in order to most reliably and properly rank the types of these Mythicals. If you would like to check out those videos from Wolf to get his full explanations, you can check them out within the footage credits that are linked in the description below. With that said though, Phione ultimately tops the group here with the worst typing of Pure Water, followed by Keldeo with Water Fighting, and then Meltan with Pure Steel. Now, none of these Pokemon's types are actually bad at all. In fact, they're all great, essentially all being an A tier or better according to Wolf. But essentially, Meltan's Steel type wins out here because of its defensive capabilities, and Keldeo's Water Fighting type essentially just wins a tiebreaker against Phione's Pure Water for being a dual type as opposed to a monotype like Phione. But that is just my own personal evaluation on top of Wolf's analysis. Now we're going to go ahead and look at abilities though. For abilities, I also wanted to be as comprehensive as possible in my analysis, because there's also a lot of nuance with abilities too. So I consulted a community tier list over on Tiermaker that has all the abilities ranked based on multiple tier lists that were submitted by various people. I also cross-checked this tier list with other tier lists to verify the general accuracy and sentiment regarding these rankings to ensure that this was as definitive as we could possibly get on something like this, and that is ultimately what these rankings are based on. With that in mind, Keldeo ends up on the losing side of things here, since its justified ability was consistently ranked the lowest in all of the different rankings I consulted. And personally, I can see why as well. It's not bad by any means, but it is a bit situational in requiring a dark type move to hit you in order to activate it. This would then be followed by Fion's Hydration ability and Meltan's Magnet Pull, which ultimately comes in last place, but also means it's the best, so Meltan is safe for now. And then lastly, we have the event category, which Meltan wasn't so lucky in because it ultimately loses out, since while its introduction via Pokemon Go was very unique and cool, it doesn't really have anything in the main series games to speak of in terms of an in-game event, while Keldeo does have such an event to its name, and so does Fion technically, as it was a part of the Manaphy event in Legends Arceus. Now that we have evaluated each category though, here's how it's gonna go. First place, or the worst in each category, will get 3 points, second will get 2, and third will get 1. In the event category, we're not going to critique the events themselves in order to stay objective, and are only going to be evaluating whether or not the Pokemon has an in-game event or not. So, if they do not, since we're evaluating the worst Pokemon here, they get 1 point, and if they do, they get 0 points, and then we'll add all of these points up together that they have earned for these various categories, and the Pokemon with the most points will be determined the worst mythical Pokemon of them all. With that explained though, it's time to reveal that worst mythical Pokemon that is out there, and that would be none other than Fion. Fion was in the top 1 or 2 in each of the first 3 categories that we judged it in, which got it the most points, and honestly, this totally checks out because Fion was the very first Pokemon that I personally thought of when I asked myself who the worst mythical is, and there's a lot of the same sentiment out there in the general community as well. It's cool, don't get me wrong, but it's basically like a knockoff Manaphy essentially, and it just doesn't live up to the other mythical Pokemon that it's grouped with, and as I mentioned, it wasn't even clear if it was a mythical Pokemon or not for a while. So Fion as the worst mythical totally checks out as far as I'm concerned, but now with that established, we're gonna go ahead and look at what is probably a bit more of an interesting situation and see who the worst mythical is amongst the bulk of the group who have a 600 base stat total or greater. So let's go ahead and check that out. Base stat wise, they're basically all tied for the worst at 600, as we talked about before, with the couple of exceptions to this being Arceus, who has a 720 base stat total, Diancie, who can Mega Evolve and therefore achieve a 700 base stat total, and Hoopa Unbound, whose base stat total is 680. So that doesn't exactly single anybody out to start off with, but someone does indeed jump out of the pack when we look at typings. Both Hoopa Confined and Hoopa Unbound are amongst the absolute worst mythicals type-wise, at least according to the expertise of Wolf Glick. These two forms of Hoopa have different types, not to mention base stat totals, so I sort of counted them separately here, but it didn't really matter whether I lumped them together or separately, because they both have one of the worst type combos in the game, according to Wolf. He gave their Psychic Dark and Psychic Ghost type combinations F and D tier rankings, and yeah, once again, maybe that's just how he feels, but he's literally a former world champion, so I don't think it's too much of a stretch to work off of his personal analysis for this. Meanwhile, Celebi is also here as well, so it's not just Hoopa, as it sits between the two Hoopa forms with its Grass Psychic type, which also sat in the F tier for Wolf, thanks to its 7 weaknesses. Ability-wise, we have an interesting hodgepodge of different Pokemon. Arceus sits at the top of the worst list here though, with its multi-type ability, which honestly makes a lot of sense since when you think about it, it basically has no ability at all thanks to multi-type's effect, since it requires Arceus's plates as held items in order to activate the ability. So essentially, you either give Arceus a plate, and for all intents and purposes, it's the plate that's giving Arceus its new type, which then robs it of an additional ability effect on top of its held item effect, or you don't give Arceus a plate and instead use some other item, which also makes its ability useless since it relies on the plates to do anything at all. So yeah, ironically enough, the god of Pokemon easily has the worst ability here. In second place though are Hoopa and Zarude, and they're tied here since they're ranked pretty similarly across the board based on the rankings that I looked at, and since abilities are so different and do such different things, it's hard to match them up against each other one-on-one and just pick one winner. So they both get to be second worst and therefore will both get points, since Magician for Hoopa and Leaf Guard for Zarude were both ranked in the D range amongst the rankings that I analyzed. Deoxys, Manaphy, Darkrai, Victini, and Melmetal all share third place for the same reason, with their abilities all being ranked in the C tier, so they'll all get 1 point when we tally up the scores. Event-wise, a little over half of the remaining mons that we're looking at here have received an in-game event, so they will be spared while the remainder of those Mythicals will all get a point for not having an in-game event. And with that said, that brings us to our winner. Hoopa is the worst mythical Pokemon here outside of Fion in this larger bulk group. Even when counting its 2 forms as separate Pokemon because of the different typings and stats like I mentioned earlier, both of them still finished in the top 3 in terms of the point totals, with Celebi placing third. The typings in both its forms have a lot of holes and weaknesses as we mentioned earlier, and as Wolf mentions in his videos, its ability isn't seen as anything special, and it doesn't really have any in-game event to speak of. That's despite the fact that Hoopa's powers are pretty connected with some of the lore in Gen 6, and is pretty clearly the reason why Mirage spots appear in Oraz, yet it never really gets the chance to be in the spotlight itself in the games at all. Don't get me wrong, I like Hoopa myself, I think it's a perfectly good Pokemon, but to me it is also a microcosm of the problems that mythical Pokemon have had over the years. So while it's not absolutely the worst mythical thanks to Fion, it basically being the second worst and the worst amongst the larger group of mythical Pokemon totally makes sense to me as well. But what do you guys think? Do you think these rankings were on the right track, or is there something you'd change about them? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you haven't already for more. Also, be sure to pick up a Folkachi plush with the link in the description to get that free limited edition Folkachi trading card as well. The card is only available until February 9th before it's gone, so be sure to act now so you don't miss out. And it also helps out the channel a ton, so it's very much appreciated. With that said, I'll be back very soon with another new video, and until then, as always, thanks so much for watching this one, I really appreciate it, and I will smell you guys later.